Hello, everyone. Tonight we're going to step into the restless waves of the North Sea, a place where the water is cold, the winds are sharp, and every sound of the tide can feel like the ocean is whispering secrets back at you. It's May 2002, and a man named John Darwin pushes a red canoe into the water near the coastal town of Seaton Carew in England. That canoe, that single decision to paddle into the sea, will spark one of the strangest missing person cases Britain has ever seen. A man has vanished, a husband, a father, a neighbor, a life just gone. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you really like what I'm doing here. And please drop a comment about where you're listening from and what you do in your day-to-day life. Who knows, you might find someone nearby who's also sitting in the dark right now, headphones on, following this very mystery with you. Now turn off the lights, lie back on your comfy cushions, and let's get moving tonight. The image I want you to hold is this early morning, pale sunlight bleeding over a gray horizon. The town is quiet, dogs bark in backyards, someone's putting the kettle on. And John Darwin, dressed in ordinary outdoor clothes, sets off toward the beach with a canoe that's just slightly too bright for the drab landscape. Locals see him. A few nod politely. No one thinks it will be the last time they'll see him for years. The North Sea isn't a forgiving place. It's cold, restless, unpredictable. Fishermen and lifeboat crews know it well. They treat it with respect because they understand how quickly it can turn. John isn't a seasoned mariner. He isn't a young man either. He's 51, a prison officer by trade, and his life is, at least on the surface, pretty ordinary. Married, 2 grown sons, a mortgage. A bit of debt, perhaps, but nothing people around him would gossip about in the corner shop. But when his canoe doesn't return, when hours pass without sight of him, worry builds like storm clouds. His wife, Anne, reports him missing, her voice shaking as she explains to police that John had gone out alone and not come back. Soon the Coast Guard is mobilized. Lifeboats are dispatched. Helicopters scan the surface of the water. Locals in waterproof jackets stand along the shoreline, shading their eyes against the drizzle, hoping to see even a speck of red bobbing in the distance. And what do they find? Not John, not a body, but a broken paddle, half of it washed ashore like a sad fragment of a story. It's the kind of detail that investigators never forget. A man missing at sea is one thing. A missing man with a snapped paddle left behind that whispers of danger, of tragedy, of finality. By evening, panic is already thick in the air. Reporters turn up, the kind who thrive on the mix of saltwater drama and human grief. Neighbors whisper in hushed tones, "He wasn't that reckless, was he? Why would he go out alone?" Some shake their heads and mutter about the sea taking another life. Others tilt their eyebrows, already wondering if there's more to it. And here's the strange thing. The search continues for days, but no body ever surfaces. People drown and bodies usually wash up. That's a cruel truth of the sea. Yet, in John's case, nothing. Just silence. Just absence. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the broken paddle was really snapped in a wave or whether it was staged, placed just right to sell a story. At the time, though, that suspicion feels too cruel to voice aloud. People want to believe in accidents, not in hoaxes. Anne Darwin, the supposed widow, becomes the face of that grief. Cameras capture her pale face, her soft voice, her insistence that John loved the sea, that he wouldn't just vanish if he could help it. Friends come by with casseroles and flowers, whispering in the hallway, offering quiet hugs. Their sons, Mark and Anthony, are devastated. They look at the water's horizon as if it swallowed their father whole. The town moves on as towns always do. But there's a hollow space in Seaton Carew now, the space of a missing man, a missing father, a missing husband. And in the pubs over pints, the theories ripple. Some say it was a tragic accident, end of story. Others shake their heads, saying the sea may be dangerous, but it also doesn't just hide people forever. One fisherman mutters, "If he drowned out there, he'd have come back to us by now." That's where we leave the opening scene. A man disappears into the water, leaving only fragments behind. The community feels the chill of mystery settling in like mist rolling off the waves. And somewhere behind that curtain of uncertainty, a secret is already taking shape. Because what no one realizes in that moment is that John Darwin hasn't been swallowed by the sea at all. The search for John Darwin doesn't just fade quietly. For days after his disappearance, the North Sea is combed like a battlefield. Lifeboats slice through gray waves, helicopters circle overhead, and volunteers line the coast with binoculars. Even the dogs seem restless noses twitching in the salt air, as if they too sense something unnatural lingering. The red canoe, bright, almost cartoonish against the grim ocean, is eventually found wrecked, battered, drifting in pieces. That discovery settles like a stone in everyone's stomach. A missing man is one thing, a destroyed canoe is another. The story feels more final now, like the sea has had its meal and will give back nothing more. And yet, there's something off. Neighbors whisper about it as they stand by their garden fences, leaning on shovels or mugs of tea. He wasn't an experienced sailor, sure, but why would he go out that far, one says? That paddle, though. Looks too neat to me, mutters another. Suspicion doesn't shout, it simmers. For the investigators, the case is a puzzle without enough pieces. The sea is treacherous, but they're trained to look at the details. One helicopter pilot notes how clear the waters had been that day, calm, compared to the usual mood swings of the North Sea. A Coast Guard officer mentions that statistically a drowned body resurfaces within days, yet the waves give them nothing. Still, official reports chalk it up to misfortune. The North Sea is notorious for taking lives. Perhaps this was just another. That's the line that makes its way into the newspapers. But here's the strange or unusual detail. On the very first night of the search, a resident claims he saw lights flickering inside the Darwin's house, two shadows moving across the curtains when Anne was supposedly alone. He shrugs it off at the time, assuming it's neighbors checking in or relatives offering comfort. Nobody reports it. Nobody thinks it matters. But years later, investigators will revisit that moment and shake their heads. Anne Darwin, meanwhile, plays her part with delicate precision. She speaks to the press in soft tones, her grief palpable but restrained. There's no screaming breakdowns or dramatic scenes, just quiet sorrow. Reporters eat up the widow who keeps her chin up. But some locals whisper that she seems a little too composed. One shopkeeper remembers her coming in for milk, eyes dry, movements precise, almost rehearsed. Another neighbor swears she spotted Anne paying bills at the post office the day after the disappearance, acting like nothing had changed. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether Anne's early behavior was genuine grief numbed by shock or the cool detachment of someone playing a role. Still, public sympathy leans in her favor. People bring casseroles, cards, and flowers. The sons, Mark and Anthony, return home crushed by the loss. They're young men in their 20s with careers ahead, but suddenly they're fatherless. Their mother clings to them, and they cling back. They all go down to the beach together, standing at the waterline, staring out at the horizon where the red canoe was last seen. One of them mutters, "It doesn't make sense. He was careful. He wouldn't just disappear." The days bleed into weeks. The search efforts dwindle. Officials quietly file away their reports, closing the active investigation. In the pubs of Seton Carew, the talk shifts from the missing man to the football scores. Though the Canoe Man lingers like a ghost in conversation, it becomes a local myth almost instantly. Fishermen tell the story to outsiders. A bloke went out in a canoe, never came back. Sea swallowed him whole. Kids dare each other to paddle out beyond the breakers, whispering that maybe Darwin's ghost is still out there, paddling in circles. But inside the Darwin house, something else entirely is happening. Curtains are kept drawn, visitors are discouraged, and Anne keeps her answers short when neighbors knock on the door. Some chalk it up to grief. Others sense something more, like the house is guarding a secret. And somewhere inside, in a room with blinds pulled shut, a man is very much alive. Anne Darwin becomes the face of a tragedy, whether she wants it or not. When reporters gather outside the house, she answers the door in muted, closed voice, low, her hands folded together as though she's holding herself upright by sheer will. "It's a terrible accident," she tells them. "I just want time with my family." And they nod, scribbling furiously, recording every fragile word. The image of the grieving widow is powerful. Newspapers splash her photograph across their front pages. Her posture, slightly hunched eyes, cast down tugs at public sympathy. She's described as dignified, as brave, as an example of stoicism in the face of loss. People who've never met her feel sorry for her. They post cards through her letterbox. They leave flowers on the step. Yet behind the soft lamplight of her living room, a different drama unfolds. She's juggling paperwork, endless forms, and what feels like a mountain of debt. See, what the cameras don't know and what the neighbors only guess is that the Darwins are drowning financially. They've got multiple properties, but most are heavily mortgaged. Bills pile up like sandbags against a rising tide. John's salary as a prison officer wasn't stretching enough. And now, with her husband gone, Anne has the unenviable task of managing the wreckage. She begins selling properties, telling people she can't cope with the upkeep. Each sale looks ordinary on paper, a widow trimming her responsibilities. But quietly, questions start to surface. Why so many properties at once? Why so quickly? It doesn't help that her sons Mark and Anthony are watching with bewilderment. They are grieving, sincerely believing their father has been taken by the sea. They hug their mother when she cries. They tell her she's strong. But they don't understand why she seems so focused on paperwork. They chalk it up to her way of coping. Everyone handles grief differently, right? And here's the unusual detail: neighbors recall that Anne didn't always seem broken. One woman swears she heard Anne laughing on the phone late at night just weeks after John's supposed death. Another claims to have seen her drive past with the car windows down, music playing, her face calm. People convince themselves they're imagining things. Grief is complicated. But when they retell these memories years later, the pieces fall into place with chilling clarity. Publicly, Anne plays the part. Privately, she tightens her grip on the family finances. The insurance companies are involved now, slowly processing claims that run into the hundreds of thousands. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether Anne filed those claims with trembling hands or with quiet confidence, knowing she wasn't a widow at all. Because upstairs, hidden away from the eyes of neighbors, John Darwin is very much alive. He tiptoes around the house like a ghost, avoiding the creak of certain floorboards. At night, when the town is asleep, he slips into the kitchen for food. During the day, he presses himself against walls when someone knocks, heart-pounding, listening, as Anne answers the door with her best impression of lonely widowhood. But to Mark and Anthony, their father is gone forever. They grieve openly, carrying the weight of a lie they don't even know exists. They stand by their mother at memorial services. They place flowers by the shore. They talk about their dad in the past tense, and each time Anne feels her chest tighten, but she never corrects them. It's one of the cruelest layers of this mystery: two sons mourning a man who isn't dead, while their mother carefully tends the performance of widowhood. In Seton, Carew, people start to move on. The Canoe Man becomes yesterday's news, another local tragedy folded into memory. But within the Darwin household, the story is only beginning. And though nobody can see it yet, the mask of the grieving widow won't hold forever. When money enters the scene, grief always gets complicated. Anne Darwin's role as the sorrowful widow isn't just emotional anymore. It becomes financial, and that's when suspicion starts to stir in places people don't always look. Insurance, a word that usually makes people yawn, but in the Darwin story, it's one of the sharpest tools of all. Anne begins filing claims: life insurance policies, pension payouts, mortgage coverage. On paper, this makes sense. Her husband has vanished at sea, presumed dead. A family in that position would naturally seek financial stability, especially with debts looming. The process is slow, tedious, and buried in paperwork, but it carries a golden promise: hundreds of thousands of pounds in relief. Neighbors watching from their windows don't see the paperwork. They just notice the changes. Anne suddenly seems to be paying off mortgages, selling houses, juggling accounts. One property here, another there. It's as if she's spring cleaning her life. But whispers rise. How much money did John really leave her? Why is she selling everything so fast? Small-town curiosity is merciless. It notices every for sale sign. And here's the strange or unusual detail: one insurance company hesitates to pay out, citing the missing body. Normally, a declaration of death without a body takes 7 years in the UK. 7 long years. But Anne is persuasive. She leans on the tragedy, the wrecked canoe, the broken paddle, the endless search that turned up nothing. Eventually, some of the companies yield, pressured by the emotional weight of her story. Behind closed doors, though, things look very different. John is slipping between the cracks of ordinary life. Sometimes he stays in the house, moving like a phantom when the sons are away. Other times he hides in a small bedsit just next door, yes, literally next door, accessible through a secret connecting door. Imagine that: neighbors bringing sympathy cards, sons mourning their father, while the supposedly dead man is having tea just one wall away. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether Anne orchestrated the fraud from the start or whether John pressured her into it. Some see Anne as the mastermind, calm and collected, balancing ledgers and calculating risks. Others think John was the reckless dreamer and Anne simply got dragged along. But either way, the fraud begins to snowball. The money trickles in, debts start to vanish, and with each cleared mortgage, the couple's courage grows. It's a dangerous kind of empowerment, the thrill of getting away with something enormous. Their sons, meanwhile, remain in the dark. Mark and Anthony still believe their father drowned. They cry on birthdays, they bring flowers to the sea, they look their mother in the eye and thank her for being strong. And every time Anne smiles back, carrying a secret that carves a canyon between truth and trust. It's heartbreaking, really, because while she's cashing insurance checks, her children are writing eulogies. While she's signing documents, they're swallowing grief. And when the townspeople say, "Poor Anne," at least she's managing, none of them realize the truth hiding in the wallpaper. In the broader world, the story of the Canoe Man is fading into the background. People assume it was just one of those tragedies the sea delivers from time to time, but the insurance trail is growing, and trails have a habit of leaving footprints. Somewhere in the distance, beyond the paperwork and the polite nods of sympathy, the first cracks of doubt are beginning to show. Behind closed curtains, with the coastal wind rattling the windows, the Darwin household becomes a stage set for one of the strangest performances in British crime history. To the world, John Darwin is dead. To his wife, he is very much alive and living just a few footsteps away. The setup is absurd and yet terrifyingly clever. John hides in a small bedsit next door, a property they own separated from the family home by nothing more than a connecting door. He has a key. He slips in and out like a phantom, never switching on lights when anyone might see, never daring to open curtains. The neighbors, kind-hearted and sympathetic, come by with flowers or food, never suspecting that the man they believe lost at sea might be sipping tea in the shadows as they knock. Anne becomes the gatekeeper of this secret. She plays two roles simultaneously, the grieving widow in public and the accomplice in private. She brings John groceries, whispers about their finances, and reassures him that everything is going according to plan. Sometimes she sits with him in the bedsit, talking for hours about the life they will one day build far away from Seaton Carew. Here's the unusual detail: John doesn't just sit quietly. He ventures out. In the evenings, when the streets are empty and the pubs have closed, he takes long walks, hood up, head down, blending into the night. A few neighbors recall glimpses of a tall figure who looked remarkably like John Darwin. One even joked at the time, "Spooky looks like John's ghost." Nobody took it seriously. Why would they? The man was supposed to be at the bottom of the sea. Inside the house, the tension is unbearable. Every knock on the door sends John rushing into hiding, pressing himself against walls, heart thudding. The sons, Mark and Anthony, visit, often trying to take care of their mother. They never see their father. They never suspect the truth. And this is where the cruelty of the scheme deepens. John listens from the other room as his sons grieve for him, their voices thick with sorrow. He hears their pain, feels it, and yet does nothing. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether John's ability to hide so close to home was arrogance or desperation. Some argue he couldn't bear to leave the family property. Others think he simply didn't have the courage to vanish completely yet. Day by day, the deception grows heavier. Anne carries it with a kind of grim discipline. She answers neighbors' questions softly. She attends church, sitting quietly at the back. She signs insurance forms and mortgage papers with steady hands. To outsiders, she's coping well, though, perhaps too well. A few people notice, whispering behind her back, that she seems almost relieved at times. But grief is complicated, and nobody presses the thought further. John, meanwhile, grows restless. Living as a ghost isn't glamorous. He reads, he paces. He stares out through the narrowest crack in the blinds. He sometimes sneaks onto the internet under fake names, dreaming of tropical escapes. His life is reduced to shadows and whispers, and yet in its bizarre way, it works. For 5 years, the illusion holds. A man declared dead is walking streets at night. A widow who isn't a widow keeps the secret alive, and the sons mourn a father who hides just a few feet away, silent, invisible, untouchable. The town forgets. The sea has taken another man, and life goes on. But in that little row of houses in Seton Carew, the air is thick with deception, and every night the sound of the waves outside feels less like nature and more like a clock ticking toward exposure. Imagine the strangeness of living a double life, where your stage is your own neighborhood. John Darwin, officially dead, is walking the same streets he used to, only now he must move like a shadow. He grows a beard, changes his posture, wears old clothes that don't draw attention. He even answers to a new identity when necessary. He calls himself John Jones, a name so plain, so unremarkable, it's almost invisible. Anne, meanwhile, polishes her widow act to perfection. She keeps the blinds drawn, the curtains closed, and her answers short. At church gatherings or social events, she keeps her head bowed, her voice low, as if grief has clipped her wings. People accept it. They pat her arm, they tell her she's brave. She thanks them with a faint smile and goes home to her very alive husband next door. It's hard to imagine, but they manage it. For 5 years, the Darwins live a lie under the noses of everyone who knew them. Anne handles finances, smoothing out the paperwork, selling properties, and slowly stabilizing what was once a collapsing financial house of cards. John lives like a ghost, avoiding contact, using the internet in secret, dreaming about escape. Here's the unusual detail: on several occasions, neighbors swear they saw John. One man insists he passed him on the street in Seton Carew, muttering a polite hello before realizing halfway down the road that the man was supposed to be dead. Another claims he saw John from his car window walking a dog. A dog. Can you imagine? The neighbors tell each other these odd sightings but laugh them off. After all, everyone knows ghosts aren't real, and the North Sea doesn't return what it swallows. The strangest part: some of these encounters may have been deliberate. John, restless in hiding, seemed to flirt with risk. He'd step outside when he shouldn't, walk too far, linger too long. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether he subconsciously wanted to be caught or whether he simply believed himself untouchable. Meanwhile, Anne grows colder. The lie is aging her, but she wears it like armor. She talks with her sons, consoles them when they cry, and nods silently when they speak about their father in the past tense. Each word they say cuts a little deeper, but she never slips. Not once. The double life hardens around them like concrete. They eat dinner together quietly, whispering plans about the future. Panama becomes the dream, the golden horizon. Anne researches property abroad. John reads about tropical weather and tax laws. They tell themselves this is temporary, that one day they'll step out of the shadows and into the sun, and all this cloak and dagger life will be worth it. But 5 years is a long time to live as a phantom. Every knock at the door feels like doom. Every letter through the postbox feels like a trap. Every glance from a neighbor feels like suspicion. Living like this doesn't just hide you, it erodes you. And yet the Darwins keep it going day after day, year after year. The town of Seton Carew grows quiet about the Canoe Man, assuming the story ended with the sea. But inside those walls, the secret is alive and breathing, and with each passing season, it grows harder to contain, because no one can live in the shadows forever. The cruelest part of the Darwin deception wasn't the fraud, the insurance money, or even the years of lies whispered behind closed curtains. It was what happened to the two people who had no idea: Mark and Anthony Darwin, the sons. When John disappeared, Mark and Anthony were in their 20s, building lives, careers, futures. Suddenly they were forced to grieve a father they adored. They stood on the shoreline, staring out at the sea, waiting for something, anything, to drift back. They organized memorials, wrote tributes, carried heavy grief like dutiful sons are expected to do. But here's the dagger: they were mourning a ghost. Their father wasn't dead. He was hiding in a room next door, listening to their pain through a wall, breathing quietly so they wouldn't know. Imagine that the two people most entitled to truth and honesty were the ones most betrayed. Anne let it happen. She hugged her sons, whispered comfort, nodded silently when they said Dad would have wanted us to be strong. She accepted their tears, their cards, their grief. She pretended for their sake, or for her own sake, that the lie was necessary. But what mother can hold her son as he cries for a man still alive in the shadows? Here's the unusual detail John sometimes couldn't resist. On nights when his sons stayed over, he crept down the stairs to listen. He'd sit just outside the living room, ear against the wall, hearing Mark talk about how much he missed him, or Anthony recalling a childhood fishing trip. He drank in those memories like a starving man, yet he said nothing. He never revealed himself. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether John genuinely believed he was protecting his sons by staying hidden, or whether he was simply too cowardly to face them. Some argue he thought the money would one day justify the betrayal and inheritance bought with lies. Others call it selfishness in its purest form. For Mark and Anthony, the grief shaped their lives. They moved forward, but the shadow of their father's death lingered. Every birthday, every Christmas, there was an empty chair. They looked to their mother for strength, and she gave it false poisoned but convincing. Meanwhile, John and Anne were planning their next step. Panama wasn't just a dream anymore. It was becoming the plan. Sunshine, palm trees, a clean slate. They pictured themselves sipping drinks in the tropics far from the gray skies of Seton Karoo. But while they fantasized about paradise, their sons were trapped in mourning, their reality heavy with loss. And that's the cruel irony. The Darwins weren't just stealing money. They were stealing years of their children's lives, years spent grieving a man who wasn't gone at all. The longer the lie continued, the deeper the betrayal grew. And one day, when the truth finally surfaced, that wound would cut far deeper than any financial fraud ever could. The dream of Panama had been simmering for years. It was John's obsession, the golden ticket out of England and out of the suffocating charade of living in the shadows. A place where no one knew the name Darwin, where no one whispered about the Canoe Man who vanished into the North Sea. John spent countless hours online, hidden away in that tiny room, scrolling through listings of waterfront villas, photographs of tropical streets lined with palm trees, and property ads promising cheap investments. Anne, meticulous and cautious, handled the logistics. She contacted lawyers, researched bank transfers, and scanned over documents like a widow who wanted to start anew. But here's the strange detail that seems almost too absurd to believe. In 2006, the Darwins actually traveled to Panama together, openly, legally, under Anne's name. They flew thousands of miles, landed in the sticky Central American heat, and walked hand in hand down streets buzzing with life. And John, the man who was officially dead in England, walked freely under the blazing tropical sun. The trip was like tasting freedom. They toured properties, met with agents, and even posed for photographs, the kind you'd expect from tourists dreaming of retirement. But they weren't tourists. They were fugitives. And in one now infamous image, John and Anne stood smiling before a real estate office, their arms around each other, as if they hadn't left a trail of destruction back home. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether this trip was their undoing. Some argue it was arrogance and indulgence in plain sight, leaving behind photographic evidence that would eventually betray them. Others believe it was desperation. John couldn't stand the gray prison of Seton Karoo anymore. He needed to feel alive, even if it meant risk. Panama seemed to offer everything: anonymity, affordable property, and an opportunity to reinvent themselves. But paradise, as always, had its price. The government paperwork in Panama required proof of identity, birth certificates, and financial histories. John Darwin, dead in the UK, couldn't provide any of it. Their dream hit a wall of bureaucracy. Anne panicked quietly. If they pushed too hard, if they left too much of a trail, the lie could unravel. She tried to slow John down, to remind him of the risks. But John, restless and impatient, wanted it now. Panama wasn't just a plan anymore, it was salvation. Back in England, the walls of their deception were beginning to crack. The money, the secret, the sheer weight of years, it was too much. John was growing reckless, Anne was growing weary, and somewhere out there, the truth was waiting to surface. Because as seductive as Panama was, no tropical sun could bleach away the stains of what they'd already done. And soon the photograph that captured their dream would become the evidence that destroyed it. The photograph changed everything. In 2006, tucked away in Panama's humid streets, John and Anne posed casually outside a real estate office. Their smiles were thin, almost forced, but the image was undeniable: two people alive and well, scouting out a new life. The camera caught them in a moment of arrogance, or maybe exhaustion, the kind of slip that happens when you've lived a lie for too long. When that picture later surfaced, it wasn't in some private family album. It was in the hands of journalists, splashed across newspapers and broadcast to the world. The headline was as sharp as a knife: "The Canoe Man is alive." Imagine the reaction in Seton Karoo. Neighbors who had consoled Anne for years, who had bought her the sympathy cards, who had carried casseroles to her door in moments of pity, they were blindsided. They gasped, pointed, shook their heads in disbelief. Some laughed at the audacity. Others felt sick at the betrayal. The woman they thought they knew had played them all for fools, and the sons, Mark and Anthony, saw their world split in half. The man they had mourned, the man they had buried in their hearts, was smiling on the other side of the planet. Can you imagine years of grief rewritten in an instant? Their loss wasn't just grief anymore. It was betrayal sharpened into a blade. The unusual detail here is how the photograph actually reached investigators. It wasn't a dramatic sting operation or some high-tech tracking. It was sheer carelessness. A property agent in Panama had proudly shared the photo online as part of a promotion advertising foreign buyers who were interested in settling there. John and Anne standing hand in hand became free marketing for someone else's business. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether John secretly wanted the lie to collapse. Some argue that his carelessness allowing photos traveling under flimsy aliases suggests a subconscious craving to end the deception. Others maintain that he simply wasn't clever enough to sustain such a fragile scheme forever. After all, fraud leaves footprints, and John Darwin was stomping through the sand. When the photograph hit British papers in 2007, the story reignited with fury. Canoe Man wasn't a victim of the sea anymore. He was a fraud, a trickster, a man who had manipulated grief for profit. Anne, too, was dragged into the fire. The widow had become an accomplice, and public sympathy twisted into scorn. For 5 years, the Darwins had survived in the shadows. But with one photograph, their tropical dream turned to ash. Now it was no longer about lying low. It was about running out of time. By late 2007, the pressure inside John Darwin's carefully constructed lie was unbearable. The Panama photograph had stripped away the invisibility cloak, and whispers were turning into headlines. The once quiet story of a grieving widow and her tragic husband was now the front-page scandal of a nation. And John, ever restless, ever reckless, made a decision that stunned even those closest to him. He walked into a police station in London and declared almost casually that he had amnesia. After 5 years of being dead, he claimed he had no idea where he had been or what had happened. Picture it, a man thought drowned in the North Sea suddenly appearing at the desk of officers, his hair grayer, his face thinner, spinning a tale of memory loss as though it could wipe clean years of deception. The police were stunned, but suspicion flooded the room. How does a man vanish for half a decade only to wander back with nothing but a blank slate and a shrug? Here's the unusual detail. John's story of amnesia wasn't spontaneous. It had been rehearsed, plotted with Anne, designed to cover the gaps. He thought it was brilliant. If he had no memory, then surely he couldn't be guilty. But memory loss is a tricky mask to wear. Too many details slip through, too many contradictions surface. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether John actually convinced himself of fragments of the story blurring truth and lie inside his own head. The reaction back home was electric. Neighbors who had pitied Anne were livid. "I knew it," one muttered to reporters. "I saw him once walking a dog." Others felt humiliated, as though they'd been part of a cruel theater production staged for years. And the sons, Mark and Anthony, were thrown into turmoil. Their father was alive, standing in the flesh. Yet instead of reunion, they felt betrayal, like a second death. Meanwhile, Anne, still in Panama, felt the walls closing in. The widow mask had shattered, and her role in the deception was about to be exposed. She faced a brutal choice: stand by John as the lie unraveled, or distance herself to salvage what little of her life remained. John thought his amnesia act would buy time, maybe even sympathy. Instead, it painted him as something worse than a fraud. It made him look foolish. The police weren't convinced, the public wasn't convinced, and the press tore him apart with a mixture of ridicule and outrage. The Canoe Man was no longer a ghost. He was a liar standing under fluorescent lights, trying to charm his way out of a crime that had gone on too long. And the clock was ticking for John, for Anne, and for the fragile house of cards that was about to collapse completely. When John resurfaced with his bizarre amnesia story, the world tilted on its axis. Reporters swarmed, cameras clicked, and suddenly the man who had once vanished into the gray North Sea was standing awkwardly in front of flashing bulbs, pretending not to remember his own life. But while John enjoyed his short-lived spectacle, Anne Darwin's world was imploding thousands of miles away in Panama. British authorities wanted answers, and so did the Panamanian government. Property deals there required spotless paperwork, birth certificates, passports, financial transparency. And when the officials realized John Darwin was dead in Britain, the entire charade began to crumble. Anne had no choice. She boarded a plane and returned to England, where police were waiting. The widow's act, worn so convincingly for years, couldn't survive a single interrogation. Sitting in a small, stark interview room, Anne finally cracked. She admitted everything. The staged canoe accident, the hidden room, the years of lies, the property schemes, and yes, even the Panama plan. Here's the unusual detail. Investigators later revealed that Anne confessed not with fiery defiance or icy control, but with exhaustion. It was as if the weight of 5 years collapsed all at once. She didn't just admit the facts, she painted the picture in full color, describing John sneaking around the house, whispering to her in the dark and hiding like a ghost while their sons mourned. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether Anne's confession was pure guilt or whether it was a calculated attempt to save herself by shifting blame onto John. Some argue she was a victim of her husband's pressure and control. Others believe she was every bit as complicit, a quiet architect of the deception. The public reaction was venomous. Sympathy for Anne evaporated overnight. She wasn't the tragic widow anymore. She was a fraud, a liar, a woman who had let her children suffer through years of false grief. Neighbors who had once offered comfort now spat her name in disgust. Headlines branded her as cold, calculating, heartless. For Mark and Anthony, the confession cut deepest of all. They had not only lost their father to a lie, they had lost their mother too. To them, Anne's betrayal was unforgivable. They told reporters in bitter voices that they felt used, that their parents had turned them into pawns in a cruel theater of fraud. Their family had been destroyed not by the sea but by deceit. The lie was over now. The curtain had been pulled back. John and Anne Darwin were no longer ghost and widow. They were suspects, criminals, co-conspirators facing the full weight of British law. The story that began with a canoe drifting into the North Sea had arrived at its darkest moment. And soon the trial would put every secret, every betrayal, every whispered plan under the harshest light imaginable. The trial of John and Anne Darwin became a media storm, the kind of case that glues the public to their televisions and sells out newspapers overnight. Courtrooms are usually quiet, somber spaces, but this one buzzed with reporters, curious onlookers, and even neighbors who had once offered Anne casseroles and condolences. Now they came to watch the performance of two people whose lies had made fools of them all. John entered the dock with his usual mix of arrogance and nervous charm, trying to look like a confused man still suffering from his so-called memory loss. Anne, by contrast, appeared pale, drained her head, bowed low as if she wanted the floor to swallow her. But no bowed head could erase the evidence stacked high against them. Prosecutors laid out the scheme with surgical precision. The staged canoe accident, the empty shell of a home where John hid in plain sight, the fraudulent insurance claims, and the infamous Panama photograph. Piece by piece, the fantasy they had built crumbled into something almost absurd. Jurors shook their heads at the sheer audacity of it all. Here's the unusual detail. When Anne's taped police interviews were played in court, the room sat in stunned silence. On those recordings, her voice wavered, cracked, and finally spilled the entire story. The effect was devastating. No longer could she hide behind the mask of a grieving widow. The sound of her confession echoed like a funeral bell for her own defense. The defense teams, of course, tried to paint two different pictures. John's lawyers argued that he was the mastermind, but not malicious, just desperate, a man drowning in debt who saw no other way out. Anne's lawyers pushed a softer narrative. She was manipulated, coerced, a wife trapped in her husband's reckless scheme. Investigators and detectives are still debating how much of that is true. Was Anne a victim, or was she quietly pulling strings right alongside him? The most gut-wrenching moment came when Mark and Anthony Darwin testified. They stood in court, their voices tight with anger and betrayal, and told the world what it felt like to be deceived by their own parents. "We mourned for him," one son said, glaring toward John, "and all the while he was alive. Our own mother let us grieve." The jury shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Those words cut deeper than any legal argument could. When the verdict came, it was swift and brutal. Both John and Anne were found guilty of fraud, deception, and money laundering. The judge, stern and cold, told them they had been selfish, cruel, and had caused untold harm, not only to financial institutions but to their own children. John received a sentence of more than 6 years. Anne slightly less, but still long enough to taste the iron bars of prison life. And just like that, the story that began with whispers of a canoe swallowed by the sea ended in the clang of a prison cell door. Prison has a way of stripping people bare. The Canoe Man and his widow wife, once the architects of a fraud so bizarre it sounded like fiction, were now reduced to numbers in the system, their freedom traded for gray walls and iron bars. John, ever restless, tried to adapt with the same bravado that carried him through years of deception. Fellow inmates found his story fascinating at first. A man who faked his own death, it sounded like a crime novel. But the novelty wore off quickly, and John's arrogance grated on people. He bragged too much, laughed at the wrong things, and still clung to the idea that he was clever rather than cruel. Prison, though, has a way of puncturing egos. Anne's experience was different. She kept her head down, avoided attention, and quietly did her time. To some guards, she seemed broken, a woman hollowed out by shame. To others, she looked calculating, biding her time until the sentence ended. Investigators and detectives are still debating which version is closer to the truth. The sons, meanwhile, made their stance painfully clear. Mark and Anthony cut ties, completely refusing visits, letters, or any attempt at reconciliation. For them, their parents weren't simply criminals. They were the source of a grief so deep it reshaped their lives. That bond of trust, once shattered, could never be rebuilt. Here's the unusual detail. While in prison, John and Anne exchanged letters, sometimes playful, sometimes bitter. In one, John complained about the food, writing that it was worse than living on canned beans in Panama. In another, Anne scrawled a line that seemed to hold both accusation and resignation. "We've lost everything, and for what?" The letters later surfaced, feeding public fascination with the case long after sentencing. Outside prison walls, the world moved on, but not entirely. Neighbors in Seton Carew still spoke of the Darwins in hushed tones. Some joked darkly about checking under their floorboards for hidden men. Others simply shook their heads, unable to believe they had been duped so thoroughly. And the press, they couldn't let go. Canoe Man became a permanent tabloid nickname, a shorthand for fraud and farce. Documentaries aired, dramatizations were filmed, and the case cemented itself in British true crime lore. John served his time with little fanfare, released in the early 2010s. Anne, too, stepped out of prison a free woman, though freedom doesn't always mean escape. The weight of scandal followed them both. They no longer had a marriage, no sons to turn to, and no real place in the community they once called home. The sea had not swallowed John Darwin, but scandal had. When John Darwin walked out of prison, he was no longer the phantom who had cheated the sea, nor the brazen fraudster who had charmed cameras with talk of amnesia. He was an old man stripped of swagger, his name forever tied to a scandal that would follow him like a curse. Anne, too, emerged a changed woman. Prison had marked her, but what weighed heavier was the silence from her sons. Mark and Anthony made it clear there would be no reconciliation. They told reporters that while their parents might rebuild their own lives, they would never again be part of theirs. It was a final severing of ties, the cruelest consequence of all the collapse of a family, not by accident, but by choice and deceit. Here's the unusual detail. After his release, John tried once again to reinvent himself. For a short while, he lived under a new name abroad, attempting to build a quieter life out of the spotlight. But anonymity never lasted. Wherever he went, the Canoe Man story had already arrived ahead of him, whispered in pubs, passed along in newspaper clippings, even joked about on late-night television. He could change his address, even his name, but not his legacy. Anne, on the other hand, seemed resigned to the weight of her past. She lived quietly, avoiding interviews, except when absolutely necessary. Yet in her rare public appearances, she often spoke of regret, not just for the crime, but for what it did to her children. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether Anne's remorse was genuine or simply another mask worn out of necessity. The public remained divided. Some saw Anne as a woman manipulated by her domineering husband, trapped in a lie too large to escape. Others believed she was every bit as calculating as John, her quiet exterior hiding a steel core of complicity. John himself, when asked, never offered clarity. His answers were evasive, laced with half-truths and wry humor. And so the legend of the Canoe Man only grew. Books were written, documentaries produced, dramatizations aired on television. In every retelling, one detail remained unchanged: the image of a man vanishing into the North Sea and reappearing years later alive and smirking. For Seton Carew, the scandal lingered like sea mist. The pier, the beach, the water all became part of the folklore, as though the town itself had been marked by John Darwin's vanishing act. Children whispered the tale, neighbors exchanged knowing glances, and visitors walked the shoreline, wondering how anyone could stage such an audacious hoax. John and Anne, once bound by conspiracy, drifted apart after prison. Their marriage, battered by lies and trials, eventually dissolved. They had built a life together on secrets, but once the secrets were gone, nothing held them. What remained was silent scandal, and the echo of waves breaking on the North Sea, the sound that began it all. Time has a way of softening the edges of scandal, but not erasing them. For John Darwin, the man once swallowed by the sea and reborn in deceit, the years after prison were quieter, though never free of shadow. He tried living abroad at one point, even remarrying, attempting to carve out a life that wasn't constantly haunted by the word canoe. Yet, wherever he went, the ghost followed. Taxi drivers recognized his face. Shopkeepers smirked when he paid at the counter. Journalists, never far behind, always found a way to resurrect the tale. Anne's life was quieter, still marked by a retreat into privacy. She kept her head down, avoided the limelight, and carried the heavy weight of fractured family ties. The sons, Mark and Anthony, remained steadfast in their silence. For them, there was no reunion, no healing, no forgiving. They had lost their father once to the sea and then again to betrayal. And their mother, the one person who should have been their anchor, had chosen deception over truth. That wound never closed. Here's the unusual detail. Years after the scandal, a neighbor revealed that Anne had once been seen gardening in silence for hours, never looking up, never speaking, as though the earth itself was her only confidant. Small things like that painted her post-prison life, not headlines, not interviews, but gestures of someone trying to vanish in plain sight. Investigators and detectives are still debating what truly drove John Darwin to such a scheme. Was it purely financial desperation, or was it something deeper, a craving for reinvention, the thrill of pulling off an impossible vanishing act? And what of Anne? Was she a woman trapped by her husband's reckless plans, or was she quietly the spine of the entire operation? These questions remain unresolved, hovering in the air like sea mist. The story of the Canoe Man endures because it strikes something primal, the allure of disappearance. Who hasn't fantasized even briefly about vanishing from their life, starting again, shedding debts, responsibilities, mistakes? John Darwin didn't just dream it, he acted on it. But the cost was devastating. A family destroyed, reputations shattered, a legacy of betrayal written into history. The sea at Seton Carew still laps the shore, indifferent to the scandal it once cradled. Tourists walk the beach, children dig in the sand, and the water keeps its secrets. But for those who remember, the waves will always whisper of a man with a canoe, a wife with a lie, and sons left holding grief that was never real. And so the story ends, not with a body found, nor with a mystery solved, but with silence. Silence in the Darwin family, silence in the home where secrets once breathed through thin walls, silence in the face of betrayal too deep to mend. Because sometimes the real disappearance isn't into the sea, it's into the hearts you've broken. Tonight's journey through the strange saga of John and Anne Darwin may leave you staring a little longer at the waves outside your window, or at the shadows between the walls of your own home. The Canoe Man didn't vanish into the sea, he vanished into the cracks of ordinary life, hiding in plain sight, built on a lie so audacious it held for years. But the story isn't just about fraud. It's about the ache of betrayal, about two sons who carried grief they never should have known. It's about neighbors tricked, communities deceived, and a marriage that lived on secrets until it couldn't anymore. In the end, the waves at Seton Carew became less frightening than the silence of a family undone. What lingers long after the headlines have faded is a single unsettling thought. How well do we ever know the people we live beside, the people we love, the ones who smile at us across the dinner table? Secrets have a way of hiding in plain sight, breathing just behind the walls. And that's why the Canoe Man still fascinates us. He reminds us that disappearance isn't always about the wilderness, the forest, the deep ocean. Sometimes it's about the quiet collapse of truth within our own homes. So as you drift off tonight, think of the waves rolling against the shore, their rhythm steady, their voice eternal. They ask no questions, offer no answers. They simply return again and again, as constant as the lies we tell ourselves to survive.